Good evening, folks. It is 10 p.m. my time on Monday, April 27th. It's about 2 in the morning GMT time, Tuesday morning GMT time. This is about 24 hours later than I normally do my analysis. Doesn't look like too much has happened yet this week, so let's go ahead and take a look. It's a very heavy news week, and it looks like news is usually a key driver, but it looks like news is probably going to be the catalyst for movement this week. I don't expect to see too much going on outside of the news events. That being said, there are a ton of them, and they this week could be a deciding factor on risk on versus risk off. So far, we've still been risk on. Equities climbed last week, but that sentiment is very fragile in my opinion. Continued weakness across the globe's major economies could see a shift in that fairly easily. So first, let's take a look at pound New Zealand dollar. Pound was the uh, currency that strengthened the most last week, and it looks like New Zealand dollar was one of the weakest currencies. So we saw a very large move on this pair, up 528 pips, open to open last week. That puts us right around 2, which is a very pivotal level. See, we have the daily 200 just below there. As long as we remain below there, if we continue to hover around and can't make any substantial moves to the upside, I will look for a short. I think we'll definitely see corrections on both of these pairs, and a lot of it's going to depend on news. There's both pound and New Zealand dollar news coming out over London's session, and then there is some more important New Zealand dollar news the next couple days following that. And of course, we have FOMC and some GDP results, which are going to be the major events. So I will first of all look for a short from this position, potentially all the way back down to this bottom area, 193. If we do break above 2 and stay there, we get a nice bounce off of it. We could see some longs from there, and these can, because of where we're at and the news cycle coming up, we could see some major shifts, and this could provide good long term in either direction. I'd prefer the short side just because of swap, but we'll have to see whether or not the fundamentals support that or not. All right, pound CAD. We didn't pull back, obviously, nearly as much. So we got a fib here on the daily. This is last month's high, this month's low. You can see that we do have the daily 200 in play, but it's relatively flat, and you can see that we've kind of pivoted around it before making major moves last time. I would prefer to see a continued pullback up to the daily 55 and then an opportunity to short from there. Of course, this depends again on whether we get continued pound strength or not, and what happens with commodities overall as a whole. If we do break above the daily 55, I'll definitely look for a pullback and bounce setup to long. Pound odd on the daily, I've expanded the triangle. This line here is from our 4-hour triangle, which you can see is still in play. And then the rest of our 4-hour triangle was about here, which we kind of broke sideways. We expanded this out to a daily triangle, which you can see the lower line here and the upper line. So overall, we want to look for that to break. However, if we drop down to the 4-hour, we do have this top on the smaller time frame, and then basically our shorter term trend line here can be areas that we can trade around on the smaller time frame. If we're trading shortly after news, we catch spikes in those areas, that's definitely a lot more risky, and I'd like to just wait for a breakout of the overall triangle to establish a direction. Of course, if we are going to just continue to range on many of the pairs, we can look at those horizontal support and resistance areas more throughout the week. We just have to see how that plays out. Pound yen, we made a pretty big break up. We broke pretty much all the EMAs, and we're up around 181 now, so we obviously broke 180. So I would like to see a pullback at least to the super convergence zone, which would give us a spike just below 180, if not into the EMAs, to look for a long from there. Pound USD, essentially the same thing. We broke 1.5, so I'd like to see a pullback to that area, to 1.5, and a bounce off of there, potentially a spike down to the daily 4-hour 55 combo here, and then a subsequent move back above 1.5. You know, we might see a nice 4-hour pin bar that touches 4-hour pin bar that touches the EMAs but closes back above 1.5. Should be a pretty good signal for a long. Euro New Zealand dollar, one of the big drivers for looking short on pound New Zealand dollar is going to be the influence of euro here, where we failed to stay above the 4-hour 200, and we still have the daily 55 above. Both of those are going to be areas to look for shorts off of this week. You can see that our down move on the daily has our 50% fib just in between those. So that fib is last month's high down to this month's low. EuroCAD pretty sideways again. That is about 200 pips from the top to the bottom of the little range that we have established here. But it's only established by a week and a few days at this point, week and a half roughly. So I prefer to see a larger pullback to the 4-hour 200, if not the daily 55, to look for a short there. We could see new spikes of that way. Euro AUD, pretty much the same thing. I don't really want to trade in this area. I'd prefer that we pull back a little bit higher, at least to the daily 55, and fail to sustain that level. That would show me that basically we had a buying rally. We pushed above the last couple previous weeks' highs, and then buyers could not sustain that level and look for signals to short from there. Euro yen, good pair to short if we end up moving more towards a risk off sentiment, and the yen should progress at that point. We're right around the 4-hour 200 currently, and I'd like to see a push up to the daily 55 to short. All right, AUD New Zealand dollar. Of course, again, we're looking for a correction on the New Zealand dollar weakness from last week. I don't really see a major news driver directly related to the New Zealand dollar. I'll have to check that out some more. Excuse me. So what I would prefer to see is failure to maintain above the daily 55 and an opportunity to short from there. Of course, if we do stay above the 55, I personally won't look for longs, but I also wouldn't look for shorts above the 55. We definitely want to be below that. So there is the potential that the 55 does hold, and we can get some movement to the upside. If we take a look at the daily, we can see that we do have some horizontal support and resistance right where we're at now. Another reason that I'm looking for the daily 55 to fail. If you do happen to take a trade to the upside, first target is going to be this pivot here at 103.76. All right, AUD-CAD, again, we've been kind of establishing a bottom and consolidating for the last couple weeks now. Not too keen to trade this pair, but again, I don't really want to trade in this area. I would prefer to see a breakout to the downside or a spike up to the daily 55 and then opportunity to short from there. Of course, we could hit the 400 or the 4-hour 200 and stop there as well. That would be okay for me for a short. Australian dollar versus the yen, we broke out to the upside above this top level. I want to see a pullback to there. That's basically 93, potentially a spike down to the EMAs, and then a failure to continue to the downside and a move back above 93. Another pin bar would be good there, just like the other pair with the same example. Up to the upside, we do have the daily 200, which is right around 94.50, which 94.50 is going to be a big resistance area. So if you do take a long, definitely take profit before we get to that area, and that will be a good position to look for counter trend short. AUD USD, basically the same thing. For longs, I'll be looking for a pullback to the 55 combo to the upside. When we get to 8,000, that's going to be an area where I'll be interested to short. New Zealand dollar versus the Canadian dollar. Again, big move down here last week. We did recover back up above the 200, and we're just below it currently. So again, we can look for the 200 to hold, look for price to move back up above there, move up, perhaps test it one more time, and then move away for the long. Of course, the preferred trade is just to wait for a pullback back up into the EMAs, the cluster of EMAs, and then look for a short to the downside. Of course, one word of caution: if this large move does actually turn out to be an anomaly and we move back into establishing a range, if we move up into the EMAs, be careful as we move back down. Definitely manage your stops tightly. New Zealand dollar versus JPY, we have a pretty nice daily trend line here to the bottom, which is now going to coincide with the daily 55 here. You can see that our EMAs on the daily have not been too reliable, the 200 and the 55. And it looks like we could potentially be forming a channel, although recently we haven't made it to the top of the channel, so I don't like the top of the channel as a target too much. However, I would like to long off of the bottom trend line, targeting at least WR1, which is a fairly substantial move. It's about 150 pips from the trend line to WR1, looking from the daily. So if we do happen to break this to the downside, I'm not interested to short until we get below the daily 200 and even below 89. A solid break below 89. New Zealand dollar, US dollar, I don't have a fib on this one. That don't really make sense for where we're at currently. We could be trapped between the daily 55 and the daily 200, which gives us about 170 pip range. We could trade that either way. We're a little bit more crowded on the lower end, and I do prefer a short from the 200. Of course, if we do break above there, then I won't trade for the rest of the week if we break solidly above the 200, but that could be a potential area to look for longs. US dollar versus the CAD, like the rest of the CAD pairs, we didn't move a whole lot last week. We'll look for potentially larger pullbacks if we do get some better USD news, which isn't expected. It's expected to be basically murky, like it has been. So we'll look for a pullback to the daily 55 in either case, and a short from there. USD JPY 118.75, still providing good support. You can see that we have a fairly solid downward wedge forming now on the daily chart. Let's take a look at the 4-hour. So depending on how the news goes, we can still look for longs at 1875 until it breaks. Of course, we're going to need tight management as we have this cluster of EMAs. However, the cluster is not really what I'm worried about. That's kind of has been the midpoint for price. So because we're so sideways, the EMAs don't hold as much weight. They're not in play as much. So really long from 118.75. The first hurdle that I'm really going to be concerned about is the trend line and 120 as a combination move up there. Definitely want to have your stop at break even before we get there, and I'll probably trail my stop and look for a break of 120. More conservative bet is obviously break of 120, pullback, and then a long, or a break below 118.75, a solid daily break below there. Definitely you want to look for a daily break because of some of the spikes below there. It's going to be potentially a very large trade as we have a lot of room before we hit the daily 200. Euro USD, we're sitting just below the daily 55. I would like it to remain that way, preferably one more move up to that level and a failure to short and back down. I will target the recent low first and then look to move further down from there. That does it for me this week, folks. It looks like markets are probably going to be pretty tough, despite what I've outlined. That's just my plan. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, and it doesn't mean that the way price action occurs is actually going to allow us to trade from those levels, given the speed of movement and what our stop loss would be able to be. Basically bad RR. That happens a lot. You plan a trade and then news essentially interferes with it, and you no longer have a good RR, making the trade invalid. So if you are looking to take a break, this is probably a good week to do it. If you are going to trade, I personally will probably not be trading, but if I were to trade, I would definitely be looking to take entry on smaller time frames and quickly move my stops. Definitely doing that in between news events, and keep a very close eye on the calendar this week. All right, good luck and happy trading to those of you who are going to brave it.